Thanks to Professor Gagan for inviting me to join you today. A little bit about my background. My name is Justin Saia. I am a public affairs, external relations, corporate affairs professional. I have a wealth of background in sort of the crisis communications, public affairs, politics space, and have worked in a variety of roles throughout my career, dealing particularly with stakeholders, managing shareholders and stakeholders in the external environment, as well as building partnerships and coalitions and communities, whether it's around issues campaigns, advocacy campaigns, both in the corporate and private sector, and have a great deal of expertise in this space that I'd like to share with you today. Just a brief intro on my background and sort of some of the experiences. I've got my start in politics, managing campaigns at the local, state, and federal level. Obviously have worked and been widely visited across the southeastern United States in a campaign standpoint. I've been to pretty much every peanut festival from Louisiana to Alabama, and in nurturing relationships on behalf of candidates running for office. So building those relationships that would enable them to get elected. Again, at the local, state, and federal levels. Took that experience and moved to D.C. and worked on Capitol Hill for a while for one of the congressmen I got elected again, working with constituents, developing policy initiatives that were relevant to local constituents and stakeholders in the districts that those individuals represented. Went on from there to start my own company, actually, as an entrepreneur. And certainly there are lots of challenges, upsides and downsides of running your own business. But again, navigating the external environment, whether it pertains to seeking out corporate clients to represent or candidates running for office, had a number of unique experiences as a part of that business that actually brought me to the corporate world, where I landed client in BP America during the oil spill of 2010 that we all remember. It was there that we came in and built a press and public affairs office for BP throughout the southeastern region during the oil spill to really manage and restore credibility and trust to the company following that horrendous tragedy in the Gulf. I would later stay on with BP as a primary spokesman for their response to the oil spill, and lived in the Gulf communities for a number of years following the spill, as again the company aided the restoration and recovery of the Gulf Coast. From there, I would move on to Nissan North America, their corporate office in Nashville, Tennessee, as a manager of corporate communications. Again, really focused on representing the company, dealing with a number of issues in North America, particularly around an international corporate campaign to unionize several plants as a part of Nissan's U.S. operations. And again, there's a unique relationship with the local communities that plays out in the manufacturing environment around those operations, and had a strong part in building a campaign to encourage employee pride in the company, but also to build relationships and partnerships with the communities around the operations in some of the southeastern United States. And then that brings me to where I am today. I'm currently taking a new role in management consulting for a firm in New York, where I will be a senior director of strategic communications, now advising clients on how to deal with some of these challenges in the external space, particularly around things like mergers and acquisitions, restructurings, crisis, and transactions. So providing sort of an expertise and some of my insights from my previous experiences in the politics and in the corporate world on how to deal with some of these challenges and how to put together strategic communications for both the external environment and the internal environment. Okay, so there's a lot of debate around shareholder value maximization and stakeholder perspective. So I want to talk with you for a few moments about that, and then we'll also provide some examples on how I've encountered this relationship in my personal career. So at some point in business school, you'll probably hear the maxim that maximizing shareholder value is the fundamental tenet of all you do in the business world. You'll hear it. I've heard it time and time again in my career. Well, I'm here to tell you today it's not always that simple. Yes, it's absolutely the case that you must maintain sound economic fundamentals in your business to have a sustainable and profitable business. That's absolutely true. So, for instance, not every employee can make $300,000 a year. The company can't spend carelessly and wildly on non-essential materials, supplies, suppliers, etc. While this principle is relatively obvious, it makes sound economic sense to most business owners. The stakeholder piece is often far less obvious. What many business owners fail to recognize is the literal and figurative costs of making the decision to maximize profits for shareholders. So every action in life has a relative cost associated with it. Why should the business world really be any different? I believe that we as business leaders really have a responsibility to ask at what costs are we actually maximizing shareholder value? At what cost to our employees? At what cost to the communities in which we operate? At what cost to the environment? And at what cost to even our own moral fiber? These are your stakeholders. And in many ways, your stakeholders can be just as important or even more important to your business than sometimes even shareholders can be. Google has always maintained sort of a foundational principle that guides everything it does. You've heard it before, don't be evil. Remember this too when you're working in C-suite for a Fortune 500 corporation. Let it too be your guiding principle. When you violate the trust with stakeholders and your credibility with stakeholders, it really stands to threaten the very fabric of your ability to operate a business successfully. A great example here, and one that touches home for me personally, is BP and the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill that many of you watched play out in the local and international news. At the time, again, was serving as a primary spokesperson for BP, representing their interests in the Gulf. There are many debates and ongoing lawsuits about who was really at fault or what happened that led to the blowout of the Deepwater Horizon well and subsequent explosion that took the lives of 11 people. What isn't up for debate, in my opinion, is the fact that BP and its partners cut some corners, particularly regarding safety processes, protocols, in order to maximize profits, increase efficiencies, maximize shareholder value. With the primary focus on maximizing shareholder value, the company and its partners committed some grave mistakes, and that ultimately violated the trust of its stakeholders, which again are consumers, lawmakers, employees, the media, regulatory agencies. This violation of trust with stakeholders really decimated the company's stock price, which again is very important to shareholders. If you recall, that stock price dropped from the mid-60s per share to the low $20 per share price during the spill, and still has not really fully recovered today. This violation of stakeholder trust nearly cost the company its license to operate and its permits in the Gulf, which is a really big deal. BP's business globally relies substantially on its activities in the array of deepwater oil fields in the Gulf of Mexico. There was actually a time where it wasn't clear if the current administration and Congress would even grant BP a license to continue its operations in the Gulf of Mexico following its actions that led to the oil spill in 2010. The company also had to fend off a number of potential suitors looking to buy out the company due to its vulnerability following the billions and billions of dollars the company had to dole out to aid in the restoration and recovery of the Gulf Coast. I think it's worth stopping for a moment and taking a look further at what happens when we violate the trust of stakeholders. Consumers, let's start there. General consumers scorned the company at every turn during the oil spill. Social media was a particularly hostile place for the company during the spill as venom spewed from the general public. People boycotted BP gas stations, which coincidentally are not even owned by BP. This action actually hurt independent business owners who own the gas stations. Local lawmakers, so mayors, city councilmen, state legislators, these individuals saw their communities and their constituents devastated by the spill. People lost their jobs, their livelihoods, their businesses, gravely impacted by the effects of the oil spill. Employees, an often forgotten stakeholder, employees at BP were really embarrassed and ridiculed by friends and family during the oil spill. You remember all the Facebook chatter and the national media coverage. If you worked for BP at that time, it was a very dark period for you. Whether you worked in the Gulf or not, anywhere in the world, it was a very dark time. My own wife was hesitant to tell people her husband worked for BP during the spill, really because she feared for some sort of recourse of action, that she might be targeted by those families and individuals negatively impacted by the effect of the spill. That's really, really scary stuff, and we can get into more of that later on down the road. The real question here is, how did BP turn the tide and begin to restore trust and credibility with its local stakeholders to ensure the company would continue to be able to operate in the Gulf of Mexico and be able to return value to its stakeholders? The company didn't pursue the same strategy as, say, Exxon did after the Valdez spill in 1989, where the company lawyered up, and there's still ongoing litigation around that accident today. BP put profits aside at this point and really focused its efforts solely on oil spill response and recovery. The company was quick to recognize that it didn't have any real stakeholders in many of the affected states, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, where many of these communities were devastated, both environmentally and economically, from the impacts of the spill. While the company did have stakes in Texas, where they have a corporate headquarters, and in Louisiana, where they have refineries, not really much of a footprint in some of the other impacted states. So the company made a smart move, I think, in setting out to find local people with instant credibility. Admittedly, they didn't have the right people, the right answers, or the right relationships, and they set out to find those who did. The next thing they did was put their people into the impacted communities. They opened offices across the coastal states with the mindset that if our employees go to school with people that are impacted, they play t-ball with kids and families who are impacted by the spill, it allows you to build relationships in a way that you can't if you're sitting in a corporate office in London or in a corporate headquarters in Houston. And so this allowed the company and its employees particularly to understand the plight of those impacted firsthand, and to begin to build and restore those relationships, which are so important to long-term sustainability of the business. And I want to talk a little bit here about the evolution of those relationships, and I'll share a quick story with you. There was a point in time where I was in a meeting with some senior executives at BP and some local officials, mayoral officials in the Gulf Coast, who had again seen their communities economically devastated by the ill effects of the spill. And they were talking about claims. The city was submitting claims for damages, and the company was negotiating with them on what would be covered and what was actually impacted by the spill. And there was a point in time where the conversation got very hostile. One of the local mayors actually stood up and wanted to introduce a physical altercation to the discussion. Very tense times, as you can imagine. Fast forwarding a couple of years later, after this strategy of sort of hiring local people, investing in the community, putting your people strategically into the communities where the spill impacted the most, that same mayor and his family would be visiting a local concert festival that the company BP sponsored. And in years past, there had been no real interaction between BP and this mayor at this particular function. But fast forwarding 3 years later, after all of these investments locally in the relationship building, you actually had that mayor who at one point in a meeting stood up and wanted to take this discussion outside, figuratively, was actually with his family and sitting in the tent, the corporate tent of BP, and felt comfortable having his family around BP employees and executives. And you're talking about a total 180 and an evolution from where we started to where we ended up. And you have people like this mayor who will share with you that the company really did the right thing by him and by his community and his constituents, and partnered with the city and provided both funds to help them recover economically, but also resources and a level of collaboration that helped that community recover to the point where it is today. So I share that evolution with you to understand that even when times are bad, even when you have violated trust and credibility with stakeholders, there are strategies that you can pursue to repair those bonds and restore credibility and trust to your organization. So I'd like to share one additional story with you. This is one of Professor Gagin's favorite stories, and so I'll share it with you again today. Again, highlights a bit about the shareholder-stakeholder relationship we talked about earlier, and again, the importance of focusing on building relationships with your stakeholders and the perceptions that that has both in the communities in which you operate, but also in things like the news media. When I was at BP, I got a call one day from a young lady who owned a condo on the beach in Alabama. And she called our press office. I answered the phone, and she was an elderly woman. And she was really irate about the fact that BP was cleaning the beaches. At this point in time, you still had what we call tar balls, remnants of oil washing up on shore, and the company had been mandated to clean the beaches. So we had enormous sand sifting machines, think of it like a cat litter box, sifting all of these tar balls off of the beach. So in essence, taking all of the debris, not just oil and tar balls out of the sand, but things like pennies and rocks and shells, anything that had been lost in the sand over the years and years that it had been there was being sifted out and really leaving behind pristine, crystal white sugar sand. And this elderly woman was outraged that her area of land in front of her beach condo had been completely stripped bare of any remnants of debris, including seashells. Particularly the seashells was the focus of her call. You guys came in, you did such a great job cleaning the beach, you've destroyed my seashell-oriented beach, which was a little puzzling to us at the time. We've done such a great job cleaning the beach that we've actually destroyed it even worse. So we talked for a bit about her desire to have seashells on the beach, and we hung up, and obviously she was very frustrated. I hung up that call and picked up the phone and called some of our beach response teams and said, listen, here's what's going on, explained the situation to them, and we came up with the idea that let's go back and put seashells on her property. And this was important because, again, you want to do right by people. We're trying to rebuild credibility, rebuild trust with people in the local impacted areas, but also nationally. And one of the things that was important was to make things right, particularly for this young lady. It was not a big request to her to kind of make things right for her and her beach condo. So what we did was we went out and we had people hand place shells all along the sand, all along her beachfront condo. And what we found out was that was not a part of a request that she had. She obviously hung up irate and angry when we last spoke, but we got another call back from this woman later thanking us for the extra effort and the willingness to try to make things right by her. She really was touched by the action, and that's a story that proliferated throughout the community, that the company really cares to do something like this, even if it was seemingly a one-off instance to take care of one person. I mean, there were probably thousands of other people who had similar requests and things that they wanted done for them, but that the fact that the company would take the time to hand place seashells on her beachfront condo to really make it right for her really went beyond sort of the duty and what the company was required to do federally and what was mandated by the state and federal authorities. So I tell you that in that little gestures like that can go a long way to rebuild trust and credibility with your stakeholders and are certainly important to changing the perceptions about your business long term. Pivoting a bit from my experience at BP, I want to share with you some of the stories and interactions I've had during my time at Nissan North America. Was at the company for over 3 years as a manager of corporate communications, managing a number of issues relative to manufacturing, labor relations, philanthropy. All of these topics really have a community focus. The company has a number of manufacturing operations throughout the Southeast in both Mississippi and Tennessee, about 16,000 manufacturing employees. Again, a huge number of employees living in local communities where, in most cases, Nissan is the largest game in town, and in some cases, even the largest game in the state in which these operations are taking place. One of the biggest things there is it's often easy to forget when you have a corporate headquarters that isn't located where some of your operations is, that there are communities that are impacted by your day-to-day operations. Again, huge presence for the company in Mississippi and in Tennessee. Have a plant in Mississippi that has 6,300 some odd employees. Have 3 manufacturing facilities in Tennessee, totaling nearly 10,000 employees. So huge amounts of employees, big stake in the communities in which we operate. The focus here was that the company a few years ago ran into a situation where there was an international corporate campaign, a union campaign aimed at the company's Southeast operations. This was one that was celebrity-laden with people like P. Diddy, Danny Glover, Common, who were lending their names in support of these activities. Also had an international focus to this, where you had dignitaries, prime ministers, foreign elected officials weighing in on this. Obviously, Nissan is a multinational corporation. We have operations all over the world, and this international corporate campaign was really aimed to put pressure on the company globally for its actions in the southeastern United States. Rewinding a bit and understanding how we got to this point, how the company ended up at this point where you have this really, truly international corporate campaign aimed at discrediting and damaging the reputation of the company globally, again, with big-name celebrities and big-name dignitaries. The reason the company ended up in this case, in my opinion, was that there was really a breakdown in a focus on stakeholder management. When I came into the company, day one, I visited some of these operations in Mississippi and Tennessee, and I said to the company, I said, some of my colleagues, why is it that we don't have a lot of relationships in the communities, particularly in Mississippi, where this was sort of ground zero for this corporate campaign? And what I learned was that really that you had a plant that had been there for 10 years, that had been successful, things were moving pretty quickly, and you had a situation where that manufacturing operation was often forgotten. It was running smoothly and really no need for oversight from the corporate headquarters, and so you had really a failure and a breakdown to continue to build relationships once that plant had been built and established. So what we had to do was go back into that community and start over, sort of ground zero, start fresh, and build relationships and partnerships with the local communities, with local nonprofits, with elected officials, with the media. Really, we had no relationships with the media in this case, and with employees. There were employees, I think, at this point felt like they had been forgotten about a bit. Still very well paid at this point in time, strong benefits, competitive wages, particularly in that market. One of the better jobs in the state of Mississippi at the time. But again, had sort of lost that loving feeling, so to speak, of how things started 10 years previous when the plant opened. So myself and others, we mounted really a campaign to kind of return that love and feeling back to Mississippi and to focus on, one, employee pride, focusing on internal stakeholders, employees, and showing them and demonstrating to them the company's level of commitment to their livelihood, to their families, to their long-term benefit, to their long-term development and career growth, but then also to the community. And I think for the company, it was oftentimes just reminding the community how ingrained Nissan was and what sort of impact Nissan was playing in the company. And what that meant was getting out in the community and spending time, building relationships, sitting down with media, going out for coffee chats, bringing them into the plant, giving them a firsthand view of our operations and in the ongoings there, talking to employees. It meant visiting with elected officials, having them come out to the plant, forming ministerial alliances in the community, bringing groups of ministers in and asking them for help and advice and counsel on how best we could serve the community as a large employer in the Jackson, Mississippi area. And so all of these things really helped to turn the tide for the company in a good way. So while you had some of these third-party groups who saw Nissan as vulnerable during this time period because, again, sort of those stakeholder relationships had been lost and forgotten, we began to change that narrative. The company was obviously seen as a part of the community, local, made up of local employees across the state, and the third-party group was seen very much as an outside group. Didn't really care about the company, really cared about its own shareholders and maximizing their value for their organization by bringing Nissan employees into the fold. So again, all of these efforts were about taking partnerships, building coalitions, recognizing that stakeholders are important, demonstrating to them sort of your commitment to them, and doing that in a way that allows the company to best operate its business sustainably long term. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the role of shareholders and stakeholders in that relationship. I've shared with you some anecdotes from my career, particularly with Nissan and its trials and tribulations dealing with an international corporate campaign, as well as BP's time during the oil spill and some struggles and challenges of dealing with stakeholders during the spill. What I will say in summary here is that both companies, both multinationals, billions of dollars in revenues every year, both wildly profitable during their times, at some point lost focus on stakeholders and stakeholder relationships that have allowed them to be so successful. And admittedly, both companies pressed sort of the pause button on a really profit-focused vent and returned to sort of those fundamental principles of building relationships with stakeholders that allowed them to be so profitable from the onset. And what you've seen is sort of an admission by the companies that they had lost that focus, and a recommitment and a reaffirmation of resources and philosophy to doing right by those communities in which they operate. And what you've seen long term, I think, is greater value and return of profitability to the companies since those changes and those actions have taken place. So again, when you're managing your own businesses, always make sure you never lose sight of the stakeholders' perspective when you're looking at maximizing profits for your company. Oftentimes you will find that stakeholders have a unique and valuable perspective that can be a huge benefit to maximizing profits for your shareholders.